Hello, Intro to Philosophy. This is the third video lecture of the summer session, and this video lecture is going to be on a refutation of moral relativism, interview number 2. I will not be lecturing on interview number 3. I don't lecture on the third interview in the regular class either, but I would like you to read that interview still. I think it gives you some interesting context historically and may introduce some interesting ideas for you to consider on your own. So let me think if there's anything else that I need to add before we move on. Okay, let's just get rolling here. In interview number 2, Libby and Isa now discuss what relativism is, what relativism in general is, and what different types of relativism are. And then the focus, of course, for this book and for our course is going to be on moral relativism. But I like how Isa lays out the different types of relativism, even though I do disagree with him on his characterization of at least one of them. I'll talk about that in a second. So relativism in general, he says, right, it denies absolutes. It claims that all things are relative to something else, right? Relative literally means, right, it's in relation to something, right? So if X is relative, X can't be just plain old relative. X has to be relative to Y, right? X is in a kind of relationship to Y. So the interesting thing, I mean, just right off the bat, we can say this about moral relativism. When people talk about moral relativism, what they're saying is that morality, right, right actions, wrong actions, good actions, bad actions, good people, good institutions, bad institutions, good policies, bad policies, those sorts of things, those sort of moral evaluative terms, like right and wrong, good and bad, courage and honesty, and justice, and kindness, and love, and all of those things. Those are a part of the sort of moral universe. Those terms pick out moral concepts, moral ideas, moral properties, if there are any. When people are moral relativists, they're taking that subject matter of morality and they're saying that it is related to something else, and the moral relativist says it's related to us and our beliefs, our desires, our feelings, our preferences, our tastes. So morality will be related to, dependent upon our thoughts, our beliefs, our feelings and preferences and tastes. So change all persons' feelings, preferences, and tastes, desires, and beliefs. In other words, their sort of psychological profile, change persons' psychological profiles with respect to the moral domain, the moral subject matter, and morality itself will change. So morality becomes something like, coolness, right? So what's cool in one era is not cool in another era. What's cool in our era, or in maybe the students' era, those of you students, let's say, who are in your early 20s or late teens, what's cool in your era right now is not going to be cool in 15 years, in 20 years, right? Coolness doesn't have a kind of objectivity. It doesn't exist independently of our psychological profile, of our psychological states. It depends. What is cool depends on our psychology. Change the psychological states so that we have different beliefs, different desires, different preferences, different tastes, and what's cool changes. Does that make sense? I hope it does. And so the moral relativist is saying that's what morality is like. Morality is like coolness, right? It changes depending upon it depends for its existence. It depends on our preferences, tastes, beliefs, our psychological states. Some psychological states might be more important than others, with respect to morality for the moral relativist, but ultimately it will be reduced to and dependent upon psychological states, psychological features of either an individual or a society, a particular culture, maybe it's a time period, all sorts of different types of relativism that we'll talk about a little bit later. So relativism in general, just denies absolutes, but there's really no such thing as generalized relativism. It's always a particular type of relativism. So Issa talks about 4 different types, right? He gives metaphysical relativism, epistemological relativism, moral relativism, and then religious relativism. I'll flip the order a little bit, leave moral relativism for last, even though I just talked about it at length. We'll go back over it. Metaphysical relativism would be the idea, so metaphysics is the study of ultimate things. It's the study of ultimate reality. Think about the word metaphysics. It literally means going beyond physics, going beyond the natural world. So physics, you can think of the sciences as sort of hierarchically arranged in interesting ways, right? So, you've got sociology, psychology, history, political science. Those are considered, that people call those soft sciences. Maybe that's a pejorative term. Doesn't matter. Those sort of, some people think, a science that is sort of more basic than those sciences might be biology, right? Those sciences sort of take some biological features or biological truths and maybe apply them to society, sociology, or apply them to the mind, psychology, or apply them to political maneuverings, politics, political science. Okay, so you got biology, then beneath biology, you got chemistry, right? Biology presupposes and rests on, many people think, a lot of chemical truths and chemical facts. And then below that, beneath that is physics, right? So physics is sort of rock bottom science, a lot of people think. Physics and math. Physics combined with math. Math isn't really a science in that same way. Okay, so metaphysics goes even beyond that. It's supposed to go even underneath physics. Physics studies sort of the most fundamental features of physical reality. Any science that studies the most fundamental features of physical reality is going to be a branch of physics. So physics studies the smallest possible things that exist in the material world. It also studies the largest things, features of the material world. Metaphysics goes even beyond that and thinks about and asks, okay, is the material world, the physical material world, is that all there is? Or is there something even more fundamental than it? Maybe the material physical world rests on something non-physical, non-material. And so metaphysics tries to go beyond physics in studying not just the nature of physical being or chemical being or biological being, but being itself. What is it to be? So the metaphysical relativist then would say that fundamental reality actually depends upon us. It depends upon our beliefs, our psychological states, our desires, our preferences and tastes. So if you're a metaphysical relativist, you're also then going to be a physical relativist, a chemical relativist, biological relativist, sociological, psychological. You're going to be a relativist about all those other things because those other things ultimately rest on metaphysics. Metaphysics is the most fundamental discipline there could possibly be. So in terms of studying what is real, what exists. So the metaphysical relativist says that what is real, what is fundamentally real, depends for its existence on us. It's a crazy position. It's actually probably self-referentially absurd, right? Because if what's fundamentally real depends for its existence on me, then of course I am more fundamental than that stuff. So we've got a nice little self-referential absurdity there. Now, Issa says something here that I think, at least at an initial presentation, is obviously wrong. Now, Issa may have some really interesting arguments that could prove this, but they're certainly not presented in the book. And the claim that he makes that I would dispute is that metaphysical relativism is the same as atheism. That seems to me obviously false. The atheist denies that God is the most fundamental reality. But the atheist need not say that all of fundamental reality depends upon us and our own psychological uh, features, right? The atheist could say, no, the most fundamental stuff in reality is matter. The most fundamental stuff in reality, maybe I've known atheists who say that the most fundamental stuff in reality is spirit or mind, but they don't believe in a God. Those atheists are rare and becoming rarer, I think, but that's a possible position. Buddhism is actually much closer to the kind of uh, atheist that Isa has in mind, because the Buddhist actually does deny that there is any such thing as reality. Um, so metaphysical relativism says that what's fundamentally real, what fundamentally exists, depends upon us. Isa equates that with atheism. I think he's wrong. Epistemological relativism is the idea that there are no absolutes when it comes to our knowledge, human knowledge. So epistemological relativism is a relativism that has to do with how we know things, with believing, with whether or not we're justified in believing certain things or in saying certain things. So I tell you it's raining outside, and you ask me, oh, really? How do you know? And I say, well, I just guessed. I just flipped a coin. I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have said that it's raining outside. I'm not justified in asserting that. I have to have some kind of evidence to say such a thing. And so epistemology is the study of, or the science of knowledge. It's the science of knowledge, of understanding, of having justified beliefs, that sort of thing. And the epistemological relativist says that the standards for knowledge, the standards for being justified in your beliefs, they depend on maybe the individual, or they depend upon a particular culture or something like that. And this view is also going to be very difficult to maintain, and there's virtually no epistemological relativists either, or at least thoughtful epistemological relativists. And part of the reason is that if epistemological relativism is true, then we'd have to, you'd want to know, well, how do you know it's true, right? Give me some reasons for thinking it's true. But whatever reasons I give you are themselves going to be relative to the particular community standards that determine what counts as good reasons for holding a belief. So we're going to get a kind of radical circularity here. Don't worry about that if that confused you. Don't worry about that at all. The issue, though, is epistemological relativism would then make the idea that we can know things, that there are truths for us to know and learn, and some people are justified in believing certain things. Some people aren't justified in believing those same things. Epistemological relativism would rule all of that out. If epistemological relativism is true, then you really can't know anything. There's really no such thing as knowledge. And of course, if there's no such thing as knowledge, then we could never know if epistemological relativism is true. And so we get a kind of self-referential problem here again. Metaphysical relativism had some self-referential problems. Now epistemological relativism has some self-referential problems. It looks like it implies that you can't know anything. But if you can't know anything, then you can't know that epistemological relativism is true. So then there's no good reason to believe it. Okay, so now we get to religious relativism. We talked about this with the Tower of Babel. The religious relativist wants to say that there's no absolutes in religion. Religion depends upon persons' own preferences, desires, tastes, beliefs, or maybe a culture's preferences, desires, tastes, beliefs, something like that. The religious relativist then is going to say things like, or is going to think things like, there can't be just one true religion because there's no such thing as a true religion. There's no such thing as a religion that is true independent of our own desires and preferences and beliefs. So religion is going to be like ice cream. You choose one based upon taste, right? You choose one based upon personal preference, what makes you feel good, comfort, things along those lines. And so the religious relativist is going to say things like, well, God exists according to Christianity, Islam, Judaism, but God doesn't exist according to Buddhism. So then you might want to say, okay, well, does God exist? And the religious relativist will just say, well, God exists according to these, and God doesn't exist according to that, and that's the end of the subject matter. There's no sort of further question: does God exist independently of these belief systems or these religious traditions? So religious relativism then implies that Christianity is not true, Judaism is not true, Islam is not true. They're not false either. They're just sort of practices that we engage in that make us feel good, and there's no truth about them. Okay. And so the reason the Tower of Babel, once again, was a version of religious relativism is because the Tower of Babel persons sort of, they wanted to make God in their image, right? Rather than conform themselves to his reality, to his nature, they wanted to conform God to theirs. So they were dictating the principles, the rules of worship, rather than receiving them and submitting to them from God. Okay, and then we're at moral relativism. So moral relativism, once again, says there's no absolutes in morality. Morality is going, and there's different versions of moral relativism. So just to give you some typical terms that are used here, we might call it subjective moral relativism, or I think it's sometimes called first-person moral relativism, or individual moral relativism, is where you say that type of relativist is going to say that the moral rules, facts, truths, laws, all of those things, right? Stealing is wrong, rape is wrong, murder is wrong, telling the truth is good, honesty is good, courage is good. Those sorts of statements, according to the sort of individual moral relativist, are going to be true if you believe them. And if David believes them, they're true. If Sally doesn't believe them, then they're not true. They're not true for Sally, they're true for David. So it relativizes moral truths, moral facts, moral laws, moral rules to the individual. Cultural relativism will then relativize those moral claims to the culture, right? So the Nazis thought Jews were rats. My family is Jewish, and so I'll use Jews as an example quite a bit in here, simply because I'm familiar with the culture, with the ethnicity, with the religion fairly well, and I'll use Jews as an example quite a bit. But you can substitute your own ethnicity, your own culture here, right? So the Nazis thought that the Jews were like rats, and so they could treat them in a way that you wouldn't treat a full normal, member of the human species. And so killing a Jew, right, exterminating the Jewish people, the Nazis thought was a good thing. Now, of course, my people, the Jews, they didn't think that was a good thing. They didn't like that. So they didn't think exterminating and just, randomly killing Jews is a good thing. According to the cultural relativists, nobody's right here. The Nazi culture said it's okay. The Jewish culture says it's not okay, and there's no fact of the matter beyond the cultural preferences. Think of it like this. When I say that the Earth is spherical, or if I say that water is 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, you think I'm describing the world, and it looks like I'm right in both of those descriptions, the sphericity of the Earth and the chemical composition of water. But Had I said that water is 4 parts hydrogen and 2 parts oxygen, I would be attempting to describe the world, but I'd be wrong. For the relativist in general, and the moral relativist in particular, there's no way to be wrong when it comes to moral claims. Because moral statements, moral sentences aren't descriptions of the world, they're simply sort of expressions of our preferences, or maybe descriptions of our own personal beliefs, or our culture's commitments. But they don't have any kind of they're not describing facts that exist independently of us. If every human on the earth tomorrow believed that it was permissible to kill persons 60 and over, once you reach 60, you should die. If everyone believed that, tomorrow everyone woke up and said, whoa, I suddenly think we should kill all persons over 60 years old. Yes, that's the right thing to do. Then it would be the right thing to do, according to relativism. Now, according to the non-relativist, the absolutist, everyone in the world could believe something about morality and be wrong. Because the absolutist thinks there are moral facts that exist independently of our psychological features, of our beliefs, desires, preferences, tastes, and so on. So, morality is about, our psychology. It's about our feelings, our intentions, our desires can be subject to moral appraisal. Morality is about our actions, our sort of overt physical actions, but verbal actions. Thought can be an act, right? My intentions, motives can all be evaluated morally. The moral relativist says there's no truths about whether those sorts of things are right, wrong, good, bad. Whereas the absolutist says, no, there are facts about those things and we can be wrong about them. We can get them right. So rape is wrong, is a moral truth according to the absolutist that we have gotten right. It is in fact wrong. Rape is in fact wrong. And it has that same status. It is true that rape is wrong, has the same status as it is true that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Both of them are certain. You can know them with certainty. They're unchanging, and so on and so forth. And so now this brings us to the non-relativist, the absolutist. And the absolutist in general focuses on 3 features of absolutism, and all end up focusing on just one of them. The 3 features he focuses on for absolutism. So absolutism about mathematics, absolutism about biology, chemistry, physics, absolutism about morality, says that it's got 3 features. An absolutist thinks that the particular area that is absolute is unchanging in the following sense. It's not relative to a certain time. And so if 2 plus 2 equals 4 today, it did 100 years ago and it will 100 years from now. If water is H2O today, then it was 100 years ago and it'll be 100 years from now. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in, 1863? I don't know. So Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1863, let's say. That's a truth, and that truth doesn't change after the fact, right? So that's one feature of an absolutist about some particular area, say chemistry, psychology, physics, biology. Universal. Absolute truths will be universal, right? So they're not relative to a place. So if it's true that the moon is made of cheese, then that's going to be true here. It's going to be true wherever you are. It's going to be true no matter the place, right? So an absolutist with respect to the physical composition of the moon is going to say that those facts are true no matter where you are. Similarly, an absolutist with respect to morality is going to say, look, stealing is wrong and it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter if you're in Cambodia like me or if you're in America. If stealing is wrong is true in an absolutist sense, then it's true at all times and in all places. Now the third feature, so we've got two features so far of absolutism. It's unchangeable. The truths, the facts of absolutism will be unchanging facts. They'll be universal facts. And the third feature is objective. That is, they're not relative to our opinions or our thoughts or our beliefs or desires. In other words, they're not relative to our psychological features, to our psychological states. So I'm going to end up focusing most of our attention on objectivity because I think objectivity implies universality and unchangeableness. So if you got objectivity, you got the other two. But if you have the other two, it doesn't follow that you have objectivity. So objectivity is the one to focus on. So if there's such a thing as morality, if moral absolutism is true, then morality is objective. So that means that there are moral truths. Rape is wrong. Maybe abortion is wrong, is a moral truth. Maybe you disagree. It doesn't matter. Let's pretend abortion is wrong, is a moral is true in an absolutist sense. That means then that people who think that abortion is permissible are just simply wrong. They're just simply wrong about it. Now they may have good reasons to be wrong, right? They may have, maybe they were brought up in a huge pro-Planned Parenthood home, and so they've got some excuses. But nevertheless, they got a wrong belief. Just like the person who thinks that, just like some Nazis who grew up thinking that Jews were sort of less human than they were, they may cite their cultural upbringing and whatnot as a sort of excuse for the belief they had, but it doesn't make their belief true, right? It just makes their belief false, and maybe we can be a little sympathetic and understanding and caring for the person who has that false belief. Okay. So 3 features of absolutism. I'm going to focus on the third one, the objectivity feature, because I think that one is the most important. Objectivity says that with respect to some absolute subject matter, there are truths in that subject matter, and those truths or those facts exist independently of what we think of them. Another good example here is biology, right? So, we uncovered, what was it, in the 1950s? I don't remember, 60s, something like that. We uncovered the structure of DNA, right? So we've got the double helix structure of DNA, right? Some of you know what that is, others of you don't, who cares? So we've got this structure of DNA. Now, if you're an absolutist with respect to biology, then you think that that structure exists independently of your beliefs, of anyone's beliefs. Right? That just is the structure of DNA, and we discovered it. We conducted all sorts of experiments, and we discovered the structure, right? We didn't invent it. We're not making stuff up. So if you're an absolutist with a particular domain, then you think with respect to that subject matter, we discover truths. We don't invent them. Now, it's important to note this here. You are all, myself included, we are all relativists about some subject matter. So I'm a relativist about the value of a dollar bill. So, I took my money out. So, look at a dollar bill. It's got a particular value right now. That value is going to change, right? It's going to have a different kind of value in 100 years. That value is relative to cultural trends. It's relative to beliefs. That piece of paper, right, in 50 years, that piece of paper actually may be worthless if, say, China, becomes the global world power that it wants to be, and maybe China decides to have only one currency for the world, right? Maybe that's a great thing. Maybe that would be a smart thing. And so they wipe out all the other currencies there are, and we only have one currency. And so that dollar bill, that $5 bill, $20 bill you're looking at right now would no longer have any kind of real monetary value. So the value of that bill is relative to a culture. Think about state boundaries. Right, so think about the state of Indiana. It has a particular shape to it. Well, that shape is dependent upon our beliefs. If tomorrow Congress and everyone else who matters, who's relevant here, got together and said, you know what, Indiana needs to be a little bit smaller, or it needs to be a little bit bigger, then the state boundaries of Indiana would change. So there's no such thing as state boundaries that exist independently of us. Those are not objective features of the world. Those are features that depend for their existence upon us. We could change them. Got it? I hope that all makes sense. Let me just give you a few more things here. Isa talks a lot about application of rules in this chapter, and some of this stuff is tricky. So I'm going to try to go through this, and then I'll probably send you post something to the blog that explains some of this in a little bit more detail. But here's the basic idea that Isa really wants to hone in on, and I think this is very important. The idea is that there are certain rules. If absolutism is true, there are certain moral truths. Stealing is wrong, lying is wrong, murder is wrong. But the absolutist isn't an idiot. The absolutist knows that those rules sometimes apply in certain situations and sometimes don't. So so think of it like this. Pretend absolutism is true, stealing is wrong. Pretend that's a true moral fact. That's a moral fact, okay? Stealing is wrong. Well, that's a fact, that's a moral fact, a moral truth, a moral rule that exists independently of us. It just doesn't apply to our situation right now. It's still a moral truth, a moral rule, but it doesn't have any application to what's going on right now at this very moment in your life, right? I take it that right now at this very moment you're not stealing. So the rule isn't applicable to what it is you're doing right now. Other rules might be applicable to what you're doing right now. Maybe the rule of kindness or the rule of respect or the rule of, paying attention or something like that, right? So the idea is this. You have to look at the particular situation in order to figure out if a particular rule or moral truth applies, right? So the situation can help us understand which moral truth is relevant, but that doesn't change the moral truths. So here's an example that I typically give here. Think about like a loving touch, right? So, say I walk up to my wife and I pat her shoulder and I give her this loving touch, right? She interprets that in one way, right? A loving touch. She says, "Oh, thank you." Maybe she puts her hand on my hand and squeezes or something like that. What I just did there in that situation at that time is interpreted as a loving touch. Now, suppose there's another situation. Suppose there's some guy, let's call him Frank, and Frank has been sort of sexually harassing, verbally harassing, let's say, a coworker, let's call her Cindy. Says all sorts of inappropriate things, innuendo all the time, brushes up against her in various ways, really makes Cindy uncomfortable. Now let's say Frank goes up to Cindy and he does the exact same thing that I just did to my wife. He just pats her on the shoulder. Now, it's the same sort of action in one sense. It's a patting on the shoulder. But the situation, that history that I gave you, the fact that Frank and Cindy are not married, maybe he's her boss, maybe she's his boss, whatever, right? That situation then says, ooh, the moral rule, the moral truth, inappropriate touching is wrong. That kicks in. Frank just did something morally wrong. That moral truth is applicable in that situation. So a loving touch depends on the situation, history, those sorts of things. Whether it counts as a loving touch or not is going to depend on the situation. Think about it like this. Here's an example closer to the examples that Isa gives. If I go to my refrigerator, open the door, and take out a Dr. Pepper and start drinking it, no problem. If you come into my home in the middle of the night wearing all black, and you're skulking around or whatever, and you slowly open the refrigerator, take out a Dr. Pepper, and slyly drink it, we got a problem. Right? So in the first instance, what I did was I took Dr. Pepper out of my refrigerator and drank it. That's an example of a taking that is not a stealing. In your case, you came and took something out of my refrigerator, but in your case, it was a taking that is a stealing. So the Jean Valjean case that Isa gives from Les Miserables, that case, by the way, if you haven't seen the movie, I think with Liam Neeson, that's a great movie. The play is even better, but watch the movie. It's a wonderful, wonderful movie. So in Les Miserables, Jean Valjean, right, this super poor family, blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to go through the details. The idea is this. So Jean Valjean took something. Nobody disputes that. He took some bread. Now we want to know, was the Jean Valjean taking, was that a taking that was not a stealing? Or was that a taking that was a stealing? So like in my case, my taking the Dr. Pepper out of my refrigerator and drinking, that's a taking that is not a stealing. Your taking of the Dr. Pepper is a taking that is a stealing. So Isa's point here is we need to know the details, the facts of the situation in order to know if that particular action counts as a stealing. We all know it counts as a taking. Now we need to know if it counts as a stealing. And Isa thinks that in the Jean Valjean case, it doesn't count as a stealing. And the reason he thinks this is actually based on a lot of stuff that St. Thomas Aquinas said, about 800 years ago. Aquinas thinks that it's actually stealing to have so much stuff in your possession that it goes to waste when there are persons who are within your midst who need that stuff. So it's the idea that, I've got a big pantry and food is rotting in the pantry, and right outside my door are people that are dying of hunger, starving, in desperate need for food. I would actually be the one that is stealing from them. So if they came and took some of that food that is going to rot in my pantry, that would be an instance, Aquinas and Isa thinks, of a taking that is not a stealing. I am the one that's stealing. Now, I don't care if you agree with that analysis of the case. The point is that Isa's general idea that there are takings that are not stealings and takings that are stealings, that general idea is brilliant. That's a really, really, really nice idea. We can think about this with respect to killing, right? So suppose I'm driving down the road, it's really dark, I'm doing the speed limit, I'm even going less than the speed limit. I'm super alert, I'm paying attention, I'm obeying all the rules of the road, and someone just falls from a tree right in front of my car as I'm going 40 miles an hour, and I hit them. There's nothing I could do. I mean, it's just right at that time they fall, boom, hit, and the person dies. Now, it's true that there's a sense in which I killed them, or the actions that I was performing at the time resulted in their death. They died because I hit them with my car. That's true. So that's a killing. Now, is that a killing that is a murder? Or is that a killing that is a non-murder? Not all killings are murders. So in the Old Testament, right, it does not say thou shalt not kill. It says thou shalt not murder. That's the proper translation. Right, so there are killings that are murders and there are killings that are not murder. Killings of humans that are murders and killings of humans that are not murders. We all agree that it's a killing took place in the car scenario I just gave you. But what we want to determine is that a killing that's a murder or is it a killing that's a non-murder? Now we can do this with every single moral idea. And so Isa's major point here is situations. We need to understand the situations in order to know if the particular moral rule applies, but the situation doesn't change the moral rules if you're a moral absolutist. So Jean Valjean, he thinks, did not steal, but rather took the bread because he had a right to it. Now, he also talks about the Nazi case, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time, and we're almost done here on the Nazi case. So in the Nazi case, right, knock, 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 you guys have all probably heard this type of example. In the Nazi case, so the Nazi knocks on your door. You are, in fact, hiding some Jewish people in your basement. The Nazi asks you, are you hiding any Jews? You say, what? So the idea is that if you say yes, you're hiding Jews, then you are now sort of an accomplice to a mass murder. If you say no, you're not hiding any Jews, then you've just lied, right? You've said something that you believe or know to be false, and you've presented it as true in the hopes that your audience will believe that it is true. That's a lie, right? So you've lied. And so Isa wants to analyze that case, and his analysis of that case is much more controversial. I'm not a big fan of his analysis, but once again, it's an interesting. the sort of background point, or the overarching, the underlying point, is super important and really and worth focusing on. It's the same point that we just went over with the Jean Valjean case, and that point is this: the utterance of a falsehood is, there are utterances of falsehoods that are lies, and there are utterances of falsehoods that are not lies. This is so important for you to understand. So, for example, if you were to ask me, if you would have asked me 15 years ago or 17 years ago or whatever it is, I don't remember. I don't even know how old I am. If you were to ask me some amount of time ago, is Christianity true? I would have said no. Now, I think that is, today I think that utterance, Christianity is not true, that utterance is false. But 20 years ago or 18 years ago, when I said Christianity is not true, I would not have been lying, because I was accurately reporting to you my beliefs. Even though what I said was false, it was there was no part of me wanting you to believe something that's false. Okay? So lying has to do with something about I'm wanting you, intending for you to believe something false that and I'm presenting it to you as true. Okay, so think of another example. Suppose some of you think that some of you probably think that let me come up with a safer. Some of you think aliens exist, and some of you think aliens don't exist. Extraterrestrial beings, ET. So suppose there are no aliens, and I were to ask you, do aliens exist? And you say, yes, they do. Yes, aliens exist. You've just uttered a falsehood, but you haven't lied. You haven't attempted, right, to get me to believe something true that you believe or know to be false. Okay? So there's utterances of falsehoods that are not lies, and there's utterances of falsehoods that are lies. Technically speaking, there's actually utterances of truths that are lies, but I'm going to ignore that for now. Okay, Nazis knock on your door. Do you have any Jews? So ISA wants to say that when you answer the question no, even though you do have Jews in the basement, and you know you have Jews in the basement, and you tell the Nazi, no, there are no Jews in the home, ISA wants to say it's an utterance of a falsehood that is not a lie, because the Nazis don't have a right to it. They don't have a right to that truth. Okay, now I want to analyze this case. I'm going to give you 3 different ways of thinking about the Nazi case. And these are also applicable to the Jean Valjean stealing case. They're applicable to killing cases. They're applicable to all those sorts of things. 3 different ways to understand the Nazi case. Okay, the first way to understand the Nazi case is this. Maybe the Nazi case, or some of those other cases, maybe the Nazi case is a damned if you do, damned if you don't case. Okay, so first way to understand the Nazi case is maybe it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. So, oh, by the way, these are ways of understanding the Nazi case that are consistent with moral absolutism, that are consistent with the idea that lying is always wrong. So 3 different ways to understand the Nazi case that are consistent with the idea that lying is always wrong. So the first way to understand the Nazi case that is consistent with the idea that lying is always wrong is that maybe it's a case of damned if you do, damned if you don't. And I mean that word literally, damned. Cursed if you do, cursed if you don't, right? You're morally screwed here. There's no way of getting out of this clean, unscathed morally. So if you say, no, there are no Jews here, you're lying. You did something morally wrong. If you say, yes, there are Jews here, you're an accomplice to murder. You did something morally wrong. And so the idea usually in these sorts of scenarios is you have to sort of pick your poison, right? Choose the lesser of 2 evil actions for you to perform, but you're going to perform an evil action. You're going to do something morally wrong here. You can't avoid it. Okay, I don't personally like this solution, like this scenario. I think that there's reasons to think that if there really are damned if you do, damned if you don't cases, then morality's in some big trouble. But nevertheless, there are some people, some philosophers and theologians and whatnot who think that is an appropriate category. But notice, the damned if you do, damned if you don't is consistent with it still being the case that lying is always wrong. Okay, second way of thinking about the Nazi case. This is the second way of thinking about the Nazi case and making it consistent with the idea that lying is always wrong, is Isa's way, right? So Isa says, look, maybe the Nazis don't deserve the truth, and so you can't lie to them, right? It's not possible to lie to them in that instance because that's a truth that they do not deserve to know. So you could say, you can say, no, there are no Jews in the basement because they have no right to know that there are Jews in the basement. They've sort of excluded themselves from knowing that truth because of their action. Here's a sort of another example of this. Suppose you lend me your axe. This is a famous case actually from Plato. Suppose you lend me your axe. And so I borrow your axe. I've got to do some wood chopping or whatever people do with axes, and then you come by the next day to pick up your axe, and I can see that you're in a state of extreme agitation. You are really angry when you pick up your axe, and I say, "Hey, what's going on? You okay?" And you grind your teeth and you say, "No, I'm not okay. My husband is driving me nuts. Give me my axe." Well, in that case, it may be, and it seems to most people, that actually I have an obligation not to give you back your axe at that time. Right? You are in a state where you don't have a right even to your own possession at that very moment. Right? Love requires me to not give you back your axe and to calm you down, reason with you or something, right? Do something there in that situation to help. So that's sort of an example, right, where someone doesn't have a right to something that they even own, and it wouldn't be stealing for me to not give it to them. And so similarly, the Nazis don't have a right to the truth about the Jews' whereabouts, and so it's not lying to me, to the Nazis, to tell them they're not there. Now, once again, this is not a solution that I actually favor. I think there's some problems here, but it's interesting, and maybe I'm wrong. I may be wrong. Isa may be right here. Okay, here's the third way of understanding the Nazi case so that it is still consistent with the truth that lying is always wrong. Think about a super wise and virtuous person. What's interesting about wise and virtuous people is they often are very clever, and they can find clever ways of getting out of these kinds of moral dilemmas. Right, where it seems like either I lie or either I contribute to murder, and so you might think of it along these lines. Suppose Nazis knock on your door. Hey, you got any Jews? And you say, it's just been such a long day. Oh my gosh, let me tell you about my day. First, I woke up 10 minutes late. My alarm did not go off at the right time. I don't know what happened. Maybe, my husband, Frank, or, my wife, Martha, she unplugged it or turned it off and never even woke me up. So I'm 10 minutes late, and so I have to rush. My coffee spilled all over me on my way to work this morning. Can you believe it? My coffee. I need my coffee. I had to turn around, go back home, change my clothes, make another thing. Suppose you just continue going on and on and on and on and on and on and on with the Nazi at your door. The wise and virtuous may be able to do something like that, knowing that they will just distract you and avoid answering the question altogether. Maybe the Nazi knocks on the door, "Do you have any Jews?" And you say, Franz, or I don't know what Nazi names are, Adolf, your hair today is amazing. Where did you get that done? Please, you must tell me who does your hair. I've got to know. And so you can go into you don't lie. Maybe you really do like Adolf's hair that day, and so you want to, you do want to figure out where he gets his hair done, and so on and so forth. So a virtuous person, a wise person, can avoid both lying and contributing to mass murder. Here's a famous case. Saint Athanasius, one of the most famous Christians in all of Christian history. Saint Athanasius was being persecuted by heretics, Christian heretics. Athanasius was annoying the heck out of them. Now, in those days, nobody really knew what Athanasius looked like. He was publishing some stuff and giving some talks in places, and they knew Athanasius was an annoyance to their cause. And so they're going around town looking for Athanasius. Hey, you seen Athanasius? You seen Athanasius? And when they find him, who knows what they're going to do to him? So Athanasius takes off, and these people discover that Athanasius has bailed on them. And Athanasius takes off, and one day his persecutors are behind him, and they're getting closer, so Athanasius jumps into a rowboat and rows across this wide river. He's rowing across the river, rowing across the river. It's getting late now. The sun is setting, and he hears a rowboat come into the river, and he realizes his captors are getting really close. They've now entered the river. So what he does is he actually turns around and heads towards the same riverbank that the captors have now just are coming from. And so they cross paths. And the captors, again, it's dark now. They don't really know what Athanasius looks like. Sir, they say, we're looking for this very famous monk. His name is Athanasius. Have you seen him? And Athanasius looks at his captors and says, yes, I have. He's very close. And he continues to row back to the riverbank that they just came from, and the captors row to the other riverbank. What Athanasius said is not a lie. Athanasius was very close. He just didn't tell him everything. You don't have to tell everything. If your child asks you, when they're 3 or 4 years old, Mom, what were you and Dad doing last night? And you and your husband or you and your wife were doing what married people do in your room last night, you're a fool if you think you have to tell your child every single thing that you did that night. You don't lie, but you don't have to say every single thing that you did. So Athanasius knew this. He was a wise, virtuous man, and he was able to avoid disaster. And so I think wiser, more virtuous persons than I could get out of these kinds of situations due to their holiness. Okay, that's it for today. Let me end this lecture with one other thing. Many of you are calling me different names. Mr. Alexander, David Alexander, Dr. Alexander, Professor Alexander. I prefer 2 different titles. You can call me Dr. Alexander, or you can call me Professor Alexander. Those are the 2 that are acceptable. In another lecture, I will explain why I think this is a very important thing for us to consider when we're engaging in these kinds of relationships. Thanks. Have a great day.